Our next speaker is Dr. Lidia Morawska. She's a distinguished professor, an Australian laureate fellow in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. She's the director of the International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health at the university, a World Health Organization collaborating center on air quality and health, and an adjunct professor at the Institute of Environmental and Climate Research at the Jinan University in Guangzhou, China. She conducts fundamental and applied research in the interdisciplinary field of air quality and its impact on human health and the environment, and with a special focus on the science of airborne particulate matter. She's an author of more than 1,100 journal papers, book chapters, and conference papers, and has been involved in the executive level with a number of relevant national and international professional bodies, and is the recipient of numerous scientific awards, including being named in the 2021 Time 100 annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Morawska.
Thank you very much. Great being on this webinar, and good evening to everybody, and good morning from Brisbane. Sunny, beautiful, windy morning. Understanding and reducing the spread of respiratory pathogens. I structured my presentation around 5 points: generation of infectious respiratory particles, spread of the particles through the air, reducing the spread, lessons learned, and reducing airborne pathogens as part of achieving clean indoor air. 4 points. First of all, you notice that I'm using the term infectious respiratory particles. This is aligned with the terminology agreed last year and published by the WHO, where we went away from using aerosols or droplets to make sure that there is consensus between different fields, so particles. These first two parts of my presentation, generation and the spread, it is something which is so well established. And the slides you'll see, you may think that they are quite simplistic. You might have seen them before. But at the end, I'll explain where the complexity is. The two final points, reducing the spread and clean indoor air, this is where the world is going now. So, generation of infectious respiratory particles. For me personally, this journey started during SARS-1, when I was asked by the WHO to join the team to investigate what was happening in Hong Kong. By that stage, I and my team were involved in particles of different sizes, but these are particles. So this was my first paper on this topic, and consequently we designed this tunnel. We've done investigations. We showed the first diagrams of very detailed size distribution of particles from respiratory activities. So later studies showed this in more detail. The first is still from that first study. This second citation is from recent summary. So basically what happens is particles are generated in every part of our respiratory tract. Starting from the bottom, fluid blockages form respiratory particles, and then they burst and form particles. A little bit different process in the larynx. And here it's aerosolation during voicing. It's a result of vocal cord vibrations, and then there's saliva and all kinds of processes happening there. It is a very complex process, and once the particles are formed, they already start changing as they travel upwards during exhalation. Deposit also on some parts of the respiratory tract. The question is, where are viruses and or bacteria in these particles? Where, if they are lining any part of the respiratory tract, that's how what happens to them. They are exhaled in a liquid bubble with the virus inside. We've also established in earlier studies and during the pandemic, newer studies, that all respiratory activities generate particles, but the louder the activities are, the more particles. So in particular, that study conducted in Bristol showed that singing happy birthday generates the largest number of particles compared to breathing. It may not sound that much difference, but the axis here, vertical axis, is logarithmic, so it's a huge difference. So what then happens? Spread of pathogens through the air. in my frustration once when I tried to explain this piece in the conversation, how it happens, I said, well, imagine that the cloud which I emit is pink, and imagine that that pink cloud engulfs you. And in this cloud, there are those green beads. These are pathogens. That's what happens. Well, it's not only pathogens, but everything else which we exhale, in particular carbon dioxide. And I'll come back to this topic. So how do particles travel in the air? Science of this is very well established, basically flow dynamics. So particles originating in the respiratory tract, emitted, and then that cloud rises. Some of those biggest ones drop to the ground, but the rest stays in the air. What about particles containing pathogens? It's much more difficult to conduct studies like this in real environment, but this was that elegant study conducted by Santarpia and the team. I think it was in the Florida hospital, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to explain all the details of this. I'm just showing it here so you see the complexity of not just science, but complexity of what needs to be considered during such experiments. So basically this line shows the size distribution of all particles, but the most important is this bit. So the highest viral load was on the NIOSH stage 1, which is particles smaller than 1 micrometer. So the state of knowledge in relation to particles emitted from our respiratory activities. The majority of the particles are smaller than 1 micrometer, the vast majority is smaller than 10 micrometers. They can stay suspended in the air for long times and travel long distances, minutes, hours, depends on the environment, can travel meters, tens of meters, again, it depends on environment, all these options are possible. And all respiratory activities, including breathing, generate particles. Vocalization the highest, but keep in mind that we are breathing all the time. And then state of the knowledge in relation to virus-laden particles. So in general, smaller particles contain higher loads, not only of SARS-CoV-2, as I've shown, but of other viruses as well. They come from the deeper parts of the respiratory tract, typically location of the virus. Contrary, larger particles, less virus, they originate from the mouth. And again, the stress breathing, speaking is the main source of these viruses. Now, of course, there is more to this, and in particular, significance of the indoor environment and the impact of pathogen stability. There have been recent studies, for example, showing that concentration of carbon dioxide impacts actually helps the virus to stay longer, increasing acidity of the air. But it doesn't change the fact that these particles are in the air and can stay suspended very long. As I said, this is a very sort of simplistically presented picture, which hasn't really changed much. More studies came during the pandemic. The point, however, is that if we wanted to calculate or demonstrate what's happening here in this room, if one person is infected, if we can test this person, if we can follow the flow, we can account for every single particle. But in the real environment, this is not possible. We don't know who is infected. We have no means of doing such measurements. So we have to do protection against this in a different way than chasing every single particle in the air. So reducing the spread, lessons learned. Well, there were lessons learned not just from this pandemic, but from many other pandemics, Spanish flu and before SARS-CoV-1. So what lessons have we learned? This was a topic of our paper published in Science last year, Lessons from COVID. They asked us to write specifically in relation to ventilation and indoor air quality. So we identify 7 lessons. I'll briefly mention lesson 1, 2, 3, and 6, and 7. So the first one lesson is about the need for interdisciplinary expert knowledge that should be the guiding factor on infection risk control and indoor air quality management in general. Well, sounds obvious, but time and time we find out that this is not the case. So why it is not the case? This was also the topic of a not that much investigation curiosity. What were the historical reasons for the resistance of recognizing airborne transmission of COVID? And this goes very long back into time, starting with miasma theory, paradigm shift later, resistance, and so on. And there are all kinds of reasons which were behind these different beliefs and the changing of beliefs. Nevertheless, there's absolutely no doubt that a scientific understanding of the role and mechanism of airborne infection transmission was well advanced before the COVID pandemic. So the first slides I showed, well, soon after SARS-1. So there's no doubt about this, and we don't have to go back to the miasma theory. Now, what happened? That, as you may remember, airborne transmission was sort of plainly rejected at the beginning of the pandemic. And it wasn't until this paper was published by the group of 36 experts supported by 239 scientists from around the world, it is time to address airborne transmission of coronavirus. Once it was published on the 6th of July 2020, which I remember very well, the next day the WHO accepted that it is an important mode of emission transmission, and it was considered one of the 4 key elements in fighting COVID pandemic and its impact on the world. Well, did we have to do this? That was later, we've published all the details of our interaction at this time titled COVID-19 and Airborne Transmission Science Rejected, Lives Lost. Can society do better? And will society do better? Lesson 2. Ventilation must go far beyond the advice to open the window. I remember very well, once it was accepted or started being accepted that infection is through the air, so we've seen diagrams or advice like this. So that was in December 2020 WHO poster showing every of this panel is an open window. So opening window will resolve all the problems. But in homes, schools, restaurants, shops, buildings which are not naturally ventilated, when it is not too cold, hot, and so on, indeed, windows are open. But in most climates, most of the time, there is an issue. Too cold, too hot, too noisy, too polluted, too unsafe. Windows are closed, sometimes so well protected against being open. So basically, there's no ventilation. So natural ventilation in the reality is no ventilation. Well, of course, with the disclaimer, that doesn't mean that no air comes from outside. Otherwise, we wouldn't have supply of oxygen. So, but it is basically that ventilation is very low. There's also an issue with natural ventilation. Okay, if the source, and I'm not talking now about the source of infectious particles, but the source of pollution, it's outside, like that picture in Sydney during bushfires. So we open the window and we bring all that stuff inside. So then this is not a solution. Does ventilation help to reduce COVID and reduce infections? It is immensely difficult to conduct study like this, taking all the factors and do it during the pandemic or an epidemic. But that study was done in the Marseille region of Italy. So what this diagram represents, so first of all, incidence cases at this time in Marseille region, and the study was from September 2021 to January 2022, and on the vertical axis are cases and relative cases to 1,000 students. So it was conducted in schools, and out of over 10,000 schools, the government put mechanical ventilation in over 300 schools. So these 2 lower curves show incident case in classes without mechanical ventilation and with mechanical ventilation. Of course, fewer cases because fewer classrooms. But if you look at these boxes here, which show incidence proportion per 1,000 students, you see that these open boxes, which is for mechanically ventilated classes, are smaller and much smaller because, again, this is logarithmic axis. So indeed, while we don't have to show this, if the virus is not in the air, we remove it, infection risk decreases. But that's what was requested time and time again. Lesson 3. better building designs that optimize ventilation performance with indoor air quality as the focus should be the guiding principles behind the construction of buildings in the future. Just a few words about this. I'll come back to this again. So the question is, do we have the knowledge and technology how to do those better designs? And there's no doubt that we have. That was in the following paper, following year, after that first paper, group 36. So these are some examples of different designs and different solutions. There's no one solution which would resolve everything. Different way we are using the space, different climates, different locations, and so on. So every building, every space is its own case. So while there are many technological application complexities, knowledge and advanced technologies exist, so there's absolutely no doubt about this. What's, however, needed and lacking is the social license to use them. Lesson 6. Ventilation performance should be monitored at all times when buildings are occupied. Well, buildings are designed with some ventilation requirements. Ventilation is set by the building management system, but its performance is monitored. It is not monitored, and times again we show that even so it appears that enough ventilation, but this is not the case. But there have been lots of studies recently showing that it can be done, and it can be done in a very pragmatic way. This is a study conducted in an educational facility in Australia, which measured concentration of CO2 with these little sensors, which many of you may already have used, in over 1,400 mechanically ventilated spaces. So what the study showed that 85% of the spaces were fine in terms of meeting the standard, proposed standard, which I mentioned in the moment. In the 15% which were not meeting this, it was also easy to say that there were issues like filters broke, occupancy exceeded, or something like this. So this is a reasonably practical methodology to do this, and doing this en masse in everybody is absolutely possible and easy and not expensive right now. So this brings me to the last point of my presentation, reducing airborne pathogens as part of achieving clean indoor air. So this is lesson 7, and lesson 7 is indoor air quality must be regulated to protect human health in public spaces. Putting this from the perspective of outdoor versus indoor air, whatever we do in indoor air, any intervention in indoor air has to look at the bigger picture of what happens. So if we consider outdoor air, we have two types of regulations: emission standards and air quality performance standards. For example, in Australia, there's over 200 monitoring stations across the country, mainly in urban areas in big cities. But I'm saying that, all right, every vehicle imported to Australia must meet the standards, every power plant, every industrial facility. So why do we still waste money on monitoring quality of outdoor air if everything's meeting the standard? Yet we do, and we find out that there are often issues. In relation to indoor air, on the other hand, we have national construction codes, differently called in different countries, which, by the way, don't take into account indoor air quality. We have limited emission control standards like smoking, vaping, but is there any performance standards? There are no performance standards, which means there's no monitoring whatsoever. So from the point of view of regulatory approach, we treat indoor air completely different to outdoor air. Well, one can ask a question, why do we need indoor air quality performance standards? Can indoor air be controlled by a voluntary approach? There are voluntary rating schemes, like very important WELL schemes, green building scheme, and so on. And they play an important role of demonstrating that this can be done, and it is being done. But the issue is, it's not a general rule, and it is creating a way on inequity, because those who can afford to comply with the schemes do, but others don't. particularly schools, basically never. So voluntary approach will not resolve the issue. Why do we need? Well, if nothing else, it convinces regulators cost benefit, which for new buildings, it's at least 1 to 10. 1 to 10 means that cost, what you invest is 1, and what you gain in terms of reduced healthcare cost, absenteeism, performance, productivity, and so on. That's the gain. It's more difficult to calculate it for existing buildings because it's, of course, different for different buildings. Why can't we monitor indoor air in the same way we monitor outdoor air? Because every indoor space is different. So monitoring is necessary in every public space. We cannot conclude what's in the room next door compared to what's here. We cannot use bulky and expensive compliance monitors for indoor every space, which means brings us to low-cost sensors. And the pathogens responsible for the transmission of indoor airborne infection cannot yet be routinely monitored in real time. There's lots of work in this space, but I haven't seen any real progress. So with this in view, Expanded Group 36 published last year this paper, Mandating Indoor Air Quality for Public Buildings, which is scientific consensus of large interdisciplinary group of experts. And in this picture, you can see us talking to this gentleman, the Prime Minister of Australia last year, and we continue talking with the government here. So what we kind of quintessence of this is the proposed indoor air quality standards of 3 pollutants and ventilation rate. We propose levels, we propose averaging time. It's probably not the most important, the values in this table, but justifications, because every jurisdiction will use their own justification, so understanding how it is done. So in relation to PM10, it's based on the WHO guidelines. So it is under WHO guidelines. In relation to CO2, which is not a pollutant as in terms of health as it is, but in terms of a proxy for ventilation transmission and proxy for infection transmission. So this is based on risk assessment for this particular scenario. The CO is again WHO air quality guidelines, and ventilation as above for this scenario. So do we know the basis for these values? This is the most important. These are the basis, and basis are always needed. It's not a sort of I think, I feel basis I need. Well, we have the framework for change. If you remember the Chadwick's transformation of sanitary infrastructure in the UK, that's when that famous experiment when closing the pump during the cholera pandemic, which began the change in this respect. Now, changing the paradigm and modernizing buildings now to improve indoor air quality would produce benefits on a similar scale as sanitation, but the efforts and the investment required to do this will be much lower. Why? Because we, by we I mean Australia, US, EU, and so on, we already have sophisticated building infrastructure, public health regulatory frameworks, workplace safety and public health law mechanisms to support this. So we just need to do this. I should also add that when we are talking about public buildings, every public building is a workplace. So that's the role of workplace. So with this, I'll finish our goal to make clean indoor air for all the norm. Have we learned the lessons already? Well, I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Morawska. Excellent presentation. It's amazing to me how difficult it was to get people to understand that COVID was probably airborne, and then that it definitely was airborne. Do you have any insight into why that was so difficult?
Well, I can say that some of this goes back to this old dogmas and the changing views and opinions. That's what I stress, is that when this kind of advice is requested, it must be consensus of large scientific groups. You cannot rely just on one expert, because my expertise comes, I'm a physicist, expertise of somebody else comes from building engineering, and so on. And we all see things differently. So unless we bring everybody to the table in complex issues like this, the advice will not be complete. And if you ask, and that was the case in particular in WHO, that those specific selected experts were asked, Whether this was the only reason, I think this is more
Yeah.
complex.
One other quick question. Kevin Kavanaugh, the host of this and the leader of our organization here, he's mentioned using portable CO2 monitors as a way to get an assessment of whether the air is being changed out very often in 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 a restaurant or a lobby or someplace you might go, airport. I walked into a restaurant last week with a friend and it just felt extremely stuffy. I said, there's got to be a lot of CO2 in here. Let's eat outside. Do these portable CO2 monitors, is that a good strategy for personal assessment of what's going on at this time?
It's a very good strategy. I have it all the time with me. I'm not getting up to because it's my hand back there. I
Yeah.
always have it with me. It fits in the
Okay.
palm of my hand, and
Yeah.
I always check what the situation is. And based on the concentration and sort of looking what's happening, I'll take the decision. If I see that it's in my power to change something, I make fuss about this, do something, and that something could be whatever. And in many situations, I demonstrated that, okay, ventilation was increased, the mechanical system, windows were opened or something, I demonstrate, well, it helped. In many situations, there's not in my power to change this, but I'm not going to risk. I always have a mask with me, then I put a mask on.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it is not the responsibility of individuals to control the air, like it's not the responsibility of to check the quality of water we drink. But
Yeah.
in this period now, when we have to influence things, the more we can do and
Yeah.
educate the society, the better. So I'm very pleased each time I show it to someone who hasn't seen this and demonstrate, well, see what's happening here and why this. Next question comes, oh, where did you buy this? How to do it online? I'm going to buy it as well. And this step by step, more people are being aware, and that's very important. So yes, this is a
Yeah.
very important. And it
During,
also
during,
shows that these little devices, how good they are, how cheap they are. So it's not a huge cost to have them, to have the sensors in our building system.
yeah. During your presentation, I took a moment, I went on Amazon and bought one for $25. Thank you very much.